It's Halloween month, so let's go over making a terrifying, blood-curdling horror track, but with a focus on modern sounds and techniques. So I'm talking intense sound design, synthesizers, big distorted hits and accents, and just a teeny tiny pinch of the orchestra. I've done a lot of these types of cues over the years without ever actually working on something specifically in the horror genre. So it's important to realize that on various films and series, you may have horror-esque moments, making these types of scoring and processing techniques just good to have in your arsenal. What we're going to go over today is a cue that I did, and I'm going to uncover each sound one at a time, how I made or processed it, and you'll have a chance to hear how I built this cue from the ground up. It's going to have a mix of being very psychological, because that's what the horror genre is really about. Sort of making a moment creepy and scary when nothing is happening yet, and then when the terrifying event is taking place, how do we get things to be chaotic and unnerving and action-oriented? If you're interested in this sort of content involving high-end music production and composition for films and television series, also make sure after this video to check out modernmediacomposer.com, where you can sign up for my free instrument tension pads. It's a really great tool that I use frequently when writing horror or psychological styled cues. There's also a lot of cool stuff being developed for Modern Media Composer, so if you sign up for the mailing list, you'll be the first to know when composing videos, instruments, and other resources are all released. With all of that being said, I'm really excited to dive in. Let's have some fun making a modern horror cue. So the very first thing that I've done here is I've tried to create a sound that's going to work well for moments where it's sort of like a split-second flashback. And that's actually really common in psychological moments in film and TV, where there's just a jump cut and some really fast-moving images. It's very unsettling, and so I wanted to find something that could sort of open up the cue and speak to that. And what I actually did, it's kind of interesting, I took a sound or a riser from a sample pack, but I didn't use the whole riser. I'm just taking a split second from it. And that's another reason that I love to use sample packs, is because you can just cut a piece of the audio file and use it however you want. So in this case, I'm gonna go to a sample pack. I'm gonna show you what I dropped in here. This is just a basic riser, but it has that really cool thing at the very end, that sort of rah. So I thought that that was a really good start to everything. So I just clipped that sound, I brought it over here, and what I did was I actually stretched it out so it was longer, and then I added just a ton of distortion from Decapitator. So as you can see, I've got Punish on, and I've got my drive all the way up to the max, and that makes it sound like this. That's pretty creepy sounding. On top of that, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna layer a big hit. So here's another sound from a sample pack. I believe this is from Boom Library, another great sample creator. And then I'm gonna layer that with a couple other hits. The first one here is gonna be from DM307. That's a library from Heaviosity. And it's got a really heavy tone. Listen to this. Hear how it has that sort of tail to the end of it? I find that really effective. So I'm gonna put those together with this sound also from DM307. I think that's really cool. So I'm then gonna blend all these things together with a bass sound. That's really beefy. Let's see where that comes from. That's an Omnisphere bass called Complaining Growl Bass, and it definitely sounds like it's complaining. As you can tell, I'm taking the pitch shift and I'm moving it down. That's always really effective in these type of psychological or horror cues, is to use the pitch shift. And so this is also being super heavily processed. If we look at what's on this bass, I of course have Decapitator. I then have Thermal, which is another great distortion library from Output. And I'm using a preset on there, Round and Fuzzy. To mix up that bass tone, I'm using this Pultic EQ, and it's really effective. As you can see, I'm also boosting the high end to get some of the fuzziness. Listen to what this sounds like with all this processing taken off. Now listen to what it sounds like again with the processing on. So that's a much more industrial, aggressive, in-your-face sound. And that's what all these effects are really kind of working together to accomplish. Now, if we combine this all together, that's a really creepy horror sound. So I think that that's a really good start, and I want to use these textures now to sort of sprinkle in throughout a ominous and unsettling sort of atmosphere that we create. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look for some sounds to help us create that. And again, I'm going to go to my sample packs. When working with a production heavy sound like this, sample packs are just super, super effective. It's a faster way than I feel, at least going through a million virtual instruments. Here's a sound that I really, really loved called Solar Ping. So I think that's perfect for what we're trying to build here atmospherically. Now let's see what we can do by adding this sound here. Looks like this is actually from Junkie XL's sample pack that was sold through Native Instruments. Let's see what this sounds like. That's super effective. I think that's going to accomplish exactly what we want. The thing that all these sounds have in common is that, again, super psychological. They really sort of conjure up images of something that is kind of disturbing and definitely unsettling. Makes the little hairs on your arm or back of your neck kind of go up. So what I want to do is I want to create this subtle atmosphere, and then we're going to intersplice those really loud, in-your-face sort of alarm sounds that we started the cue with. I think it's going to be very unexpected and create that sort of jump scare that we're going for. So here's the sound that I've brought in order to create that sort of jump scare moment that is going to interrupt this more subtle atmosphere. Definitely gets the job done. Again, we're processing that with a ton of distortion. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to double that and I'm going to drop it an octave just to give it a little bit more body and weight. That's going to be really effective. So now let's listen to what all of this sounds like together so far. Alright, so that's getting really, really cool. I just want to show you over here what's creating sort of that low-end rumble, because it is nice to have that sort of bass frequency in there. You got to remember, especially if you're making a cue that's going to be shown in a theater or something, like, you don't want to neglect the low end. It's really important, and it creates a more full moment musically. So right here, again, I'm using a just sound from a sample pack, but I'm heavily processing it. This sound is called Deep Artifacts. So if we just find it and we drag it in here, here's what that sound originally was. So just a really plain bass sound. And by the way, if you can't hear that because you're listening back on a phone, just put in some headphones and stuff so that you can get that low end. So now what I've done, and I actually find this to be really, really effective when you're talking about using bass, is that when you distort it to no end, what you're actually getting is the bass is driving the amplifier of the distortion. So mainly what you're getting is this fuzzy top end sound that is kind of really interesting and breathing, and it creates sort of a new sound. So that's what I've done here. I've used that bass frequency to completely drive this, and I'm combining it with, again, little altar boy to kind of like just play with the pitch a little bit, and it creates this tone. So that's really effective and useful to distort something low end like that. It almost sounds like a motorcycle in the distance, just this really low end rumble that adds to that sense of unsettling. It isn't necessarily musical, but it's doing the job of music to support a scene, support a picture. I feel like this as it is right now, it's really easy to imagine this in a horror cue. And so it's coming along really nicely. Let's keep moving from here. Alright, so that adds definitely a lot of contrast from the moment where we sort of go silent as if, oh, maybe everything's okay. And then we hit you with just complete chaos, which obviously is a very common technique for these types of cues and these type of moments. So how are we creating all of that chaos? What are the processing techniques? What are these sounds and instruments? The first thing I'll point out is that I do sort of introduce the orchestra, but I'm doing it in a very processed way. It's not really meant to be played live. So if you look over here, I'm combining all of these brass elements just to do these big, very sort of like cluster stab. So those sound really full. It's going to help create the contrast we're looking for. I double that then with the strings, as you can hear over here. There's this sort of chaotic short string section over here. So the idea is to, at the end there, you can hear we're creating that escalating tension that's going to work with these risers. But the really kind of cool thing is what's going on with these wave files. If you remember that sound that I used at the very beginning of this piece of music from DM307, so this is just as a reminder what it sounded like. So that was those modular effects. All I did is I just printed that. And what that means is I solo out the sound, I go to my resample record track, and I press record. And this is set up so that if I solo anything in my template, I'm able to record it and then process it. So what I've actually done with that sound that I processed is this. In this area, I cut it up into 16th notes. A reason that I like to work with wave files, you could just do things like that easily. And then I've also added this filter, and that is sort of taking place during the gated cut up moment of that wave file. So listen to what it sounds like. What I really love about that sound is it kind of naturally goes from left to right, adding to the sense of unpredictability. You don't really know what it's going to do next. And we take that sort of principle and apply it to all of these wave file sounds. Here's that scream that was in the very, very beginning. Again, just to play it as a reminder for you, this is what it sounded like. Ugh, sounds terrible, but that's perfect. What I did actually with it here is I've now taken that same sound, but I pitch shifted it up quite a bit. I have gone to my transpose section, and as you can see, I've transposed it by 15. And what that's gonna do is it's just gonna sound terrible. Ugh. It's like nails on a chalkboard. And the next time you hear it, what I then do, again, for the sake of unpredictability and chaos, which this type of music and production is all about, is instead of pitching it all the way up 15 like that, what I do instead is I pitch it down -7. Listen to this now. So you're hearing the same sound, but you're hearing it at very different frequencies and levels, and it really kind of creates this unnerving sense when you put all of these elements together. Musically, or from an auditory standpoint, you just don't know what to expect. And that is what really lends itself nicely to a horror scene or a psychological thriller or anything like that. Now let's see what happens when we move on from this moment, right? We have this huge burst of energy and chaos. So what can we do now that might happen next in a scene? Let's take a listen. All right, I'm gonna stop it there. So again, a lot of this is about sort of like tension and release. We're creating a riser and we're just experimenting with different textures, different tonalities. A lot of this is kind of written in a sense that it could be used as a suite. You could take any section from here and just put it over any crazy moment of a horror film. So what I want to show you here is that I've got this sound from my own library. It's called a fat whoosh. I use it on tons and tons of shows and series, just sort of like as an accent or to roll into the one. But in this case, I'm just using the sound completely differently. So here's the original sound. Okay, that's not too unusual. But what I've done here is I have added, of course, thermal and decapitator. And decapitator is pretty crunchy, per usual for this track. Thermal is using robo repeater, which is a preset, and it turns it into this. Almost sounds like some enormous monster like trying to slash you or something. So those are being used again at random times. That's happening as everything else is sort of like building up and creating this climax moment. So one of the most effective things that we're doing here is, as you can see, if we go to my tempo, we're actually increasing the tempo as this section continues here, which sort of just keeps the adrenaline and the pacing going up and up and up. And in order to make the most of that, is I've added a tempo synced pulse. This is from Repro. Obviously, that's going to create a lot of anxiety. And while that's happening, we have these risers going on at the same time, which are not tempo synced. We just layered in some stuff from 8Dio's case library as well, which are sort of like aleatoric string effects from solo strings. And I found those to be pretty effective. You really just don't know, are they like rising? Are they falling? Again, sense of unnerving chaos. And what this all leads to is this sort of outro moment where we get to just continue having something rise. It's a little bit more unsettling. It's unnerving. I think of like those moments, like, I don't know if it was the movie The Ring or something. There's like a faceless character and they kind of like glitch, you know? And so I was sort of thinking about that when making this. And that's the end of the piece. So let's play this whole thing back from the beginning now so you can hear what all these sounds do together, all of this processing and attention to detail with the panning, the distortion, the pitch shifting, and all these things that we sort of covered on an individual instrument basis, and what it does to create a really sort of horrific sounding track. All right, so I hope that you had a lot of fun here breaking down this track and sort of dissecting some of the processing techniques. I find composing this type of production-driven cue really enjoyable personally because you get to really discover and manipulate sound in a way that I just find really interesting and exciting. If you haven't done so yet, please like the video, hit the subscribe button because doing so is like a huge help to the channel and it's what allows me to continue putting out free content just like this. If you happen to want to learn more about sample packs and composing with sample packs, because I use so many of them in a piece of music like this, check out this video right over here because that's where I do a deep dive into my favorite sample pack makers. As always, I hope you had fun and I hope that this was helpful.